Okay, this is a question from the Godot subreddit. Hi, new to coding. Why does string need to be capitalized, but the others do not? Also, is there any reason to use int over float? That's a very good question. Let's get to it. So, to your first question about string being capitalized versus others do not, it comes down to data types. Now, everything that you store in your program needs to have a data type. And if we take the simplest of data types, or one of the simplest, you have a Boolean. And a Boolean is what's called a primitive beta type. So you can see it's lowercase. Int. So with a primitive data type, they tend to be stored with a lowercase. It's just a convention. And they're called primitives because they're quite simple. They are, if you think about the size of a Boolean, it can either be two values. It can either be false or it can be true. So it's very simple. Like those are the only values you can have for Boolean. If you think about the functionality, you can get the opposite. And if you want to use other Booleans in conjunction, generally you would have two Booleans and you would combine them in some way. So if you had an OR statement, for example, where you want to check if this or this is true, then you're still using two Booleans in that comparison. And if we go into an integer, it's a similar thing. I believe int32 is the default type of that. That's a bit more advanced than we need to care about at the moment, so we'll leave that. But if you think about an integer, it's just a number, a single number that is stored there. Now, if we go on to something like a character, like as in a single character as well, this is also quite simple. I'm not sure if this is how it works in Godot, but in most languages, a character is really just an integer that's converted into a code, into a letter that represents a number. So if you think about behind the scenes what x is, there's a number that represents what x is. So like 1 would be A, 2 would be B, 3 would be C, and so on. So a character is relatively simple. Now, those are for primitive data types, but you also have object types or classes. Now, class data types, more generally speaking, are a lot more complicated than individuals. Like you just looking at a string like test, you have 4 characters, each of them representing a code in there, and you also have a lot of ways that you can manipulate your strings. So if I just go my string dot, there you can just scroll through and see all the sorts of things you can do this. You can see begins with, you can convert to int, bigrams, you can get the character at a certain point, you can see the length of it, you can see like if it ends with a certain thing, you can search within the string, you can do also if it's a file, there's all sorts of things, there's a lot of ways that you can manipulate a string. That means that a string is quite a complicated thing. It's one of these things that certain languages make different decisions about a string. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in earlier programming languages, a string was really just considered to be an array of characters. So instead of thinking of a class string, you would have TEST as an array. The advantage of that is that it's much smaller in memory because there's not as many complicated things you have to do with it. But the disadvantage is you have to custom write every bit of functionality that you want to do with that. So for example, if you want to check begins with, and you had to write that yourself, you would have to check the 0th element of the array and check that compares with the begins with, if that makes sense. Now, classes are used for many, many things, and they can represent a whole. They essentially they're the building blocks of object-oriented programming. Now, for example, Node is a class. If I go into some random thing, we've got this event bus is a class. This represents in my game just collecting various things, but you can see that it's custom functionality attached to the class. Event bus is a complicated enough structure that it needs to have all of these functions and all these things applied to it. I can't just use a primitive data type in there to get my stuff done. So to answer your question, why string is capitalized but others are not, it's because string is a class and classes have a lot of functionality attached to them. And Godot, or for Godot script, they've decided that strings are complicated enough that they deserve to have their own class. And also, it's one of these things where I think Godot makes some decisions to make things easier for the user. So for you as an earlier programmer, it's easier to just have this class and have every array of characters like this treated as a string. It's easier to have that you can do lots of stuff with than to have the most efficient data structure for your case. I'm sure that within Godot there are ways that you can just not use the string class and use like an array of characters or more efficient things, but generally you're not going to need to with the level of computers that we have right now and the complexity of the games that we're making. So that's to answer your first question. And so like I say, primitives, much simpler data structures, and much easier to work with. They don't need the complexity. Whereas objects, classes, they are capitalized, and string is a class within Godot. So to your second question, is there any reason to use int over float? Yes. So if you think about what an integer is a whole number. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. And because you don't have to represent the precision of a float, like with a float, you have to have where the point is, and you have to designate extra data to storing a float. Like if you think of an integer value, 5 is always 5. It's not 5.00, it's not 5.000. So with an int, it's smaller. It's potentially smaller than a float is, right? Whereas with a float value, there's a few things. You have to store the value itself, but you also have to store the precision of that value as well. So with you can have a float that is to 2 decimal places, or it can be to 10 decimal places, depending on how accurate you want to get. And the more accurate you are, like if you're to 10 decimal places, think like if you got 5.0 is much smaller to store than 5.00000000000. And so with floats, you're allocating more data to store potentially the same thing. And integers are very useful in the case where if you know that you're just counting how many entities are on screen, you're never going to have half an entity on screen. So just use an integer. It's better to just use the smallest data type that you can, and try and get into the habit of understanding what your data types mean. With an integer, it just means there's a solid unit and it will never be divided. You'll never get half a unit. And with a float, you are measuring quantities of things. If you're doing some angle detection, you might want to figure out that it's gone half off of the thing. So to answer your question, that answers your questions there. So strings being capitalized is because it's a class, and others are primitives. And the reason to use int over float is for data sizing. I hope that answers all your questions, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, drop a subscribe, all the usual stuff. If you have questions about tech drop them below. I have 10 years experience in a lot of different things, so I'm trying to give as much advice as I can to newer developers for free. And if you have any ideas for the channel, then drop them in the comments as well. And just enjoy programming. Do what you need to, have fun, and I'll see you when I see you.